Hello and welcome to Page Turners with me, Advaita Kala, and I'm delighted to have today's guest with us because he writes about worlds that I am deeply interested in. I've read many of his books, three of them actually: Meadows, The Siege, and of course the latest, which is the one that we're going to be discussing today, called Spy Stories and Inside the Secret World of I.S.I. and RAW. And here it is. It's right here on my Kindle. So you all can take a look at the book cover and go ahead and order it online or from your nearest bookstore, or just get the Kindle if you can't wait like me, which is what I do when I really can't wait. So although I love the real book. I love the texture of paper and everything, but I had to read this one quickly as soon as it was out. So thank you so much, Adrian, for joining us.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. I know you've done a whole slew of interviews, so I'm going to try and keep this one a little different for you and for our readers as well. Let's just start from your interest in these stories. Be it the Meadows or be it the Siege, actually. The Siege was something that really touched me because I am a hotelier by profession in another life. So I knew a lot of people who were caught up in those attacks. I had a batchmate who was working in the lobby that night, but happened to be on leave for a wedding in the family. So he was saved. I had a student who died in that attack. He was a chef. He was shot dead in the kitchen. I think I'm speaking for myself and really for a generation of Indians. It changed a lot. We changed a lot in terms of how we view the world. Our politics changed. Our easygoing take on life changed because this was live. It was televised, and it's had a profound effect on, I'd say, the generation that was adulthood, or even I would say teens, 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds. And I think it's impacted India in a very seminal way and in the direction that we're taking. And your book was really was searing. It was a searing insight into those very traumatic days. But tell me, how did you get involved in telling these stories?
Well, the first thing to say is that we've been traveling to India since I'm trying to think. The first time we came, probably the late 1980s. We were kids at that point, and we were like on travelers' adventures through India, Pakistan, etc., Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and then we kept coming back, and we began working in India in 1994, 1995. And we were then truly still children in terms of trying to understand any kind of have any kind of reporting skills, but also understand anything about the stories. And we just kept at it and became sucked in with a deep love for the region. Lots of friends, lots of contacts who we met all those years ago, who grew with us through this period. I've talked about this often. It's when you stick at something, assuming you don't fall out, the people who are with you grow and become different people and move into different professions or climb up the rung in their own professions. So there's a virtue to sticking at something. But something happened particularly to us after 9/11. After 9/11, we were really motivated by trying to pick up alternative narratives and trying to work out which parts of the story are not commonly told. To start with, a lot of the world, because of its power, is fixated on the US. And because of its polished entertainment business, which we all love. We also focus, on Hollywood movies, and America is a very Americentric, very self-centered, and really has not much time as an industry or as a country for all the other cultures that exist out there and their narratives and their storytelling and their writing and their filmmaking and their music making. And coming from a small island like the UK, which has very little power whatsoever other than creative ideas, these days. I think it really matters to us to hear those alternative narratives. And after 9/11, we were concerned that the dominant narrative, which became one of vengeance, and to some extent understandable given the appalling tragedy of what happened on the East Coast, what happened in the US. We were desperate to look for more knowledge to try and understand what had happened, why it had happened, and also to try and understand what America was doing more in relation to the neighborhood where it was taking actions. So rather than just doing what other people were doing, which is try to see all these events as police procedurals, follow the FBI, follow the CIA, follow the cops. What we want to do is find the people in these stories, people and not the police procedural. And more than that, find stories in the neighborhood where America was operating, where people don't voice their stories. So immediately, for us, the most kinetic parts are India, Pakistan. And given that America's pact after 9/11 was with Pakistan, and that angered India greatly, that the Pakistanis still does, we decided that would be a focus for us. And the CIA, we wrote this in the preface of the book. They were conscious of having come through a terrible period in the 1970s and 1980s through Vietnam and then the Latin America, Central America imbroglio, where they'd been accused of everything from torture, training torturers, disappearances, and creating manuals for torture, and basically losing their moral compass to the point where in the mid-90s, there were a whole series of commissions that were held where the CIA had to disavow those practices. And yet, as far as we could see, all of those practices were being enabled again after 9/11. A lot of those practices, disappearances, torture, renditions, black sites, etc. And the films that the CIA was sponsoring were endorsing those practices. 0 Dark 30, on TV 24 with Jack Bauer, the whole idea of the Bourne identity. Directors and movie franchises that we may like, but that are morally absurd, if not injurious, in that they're presenting a worldview, torture works, do away with the Geneva Conventions, do away with democracies and citizen power, and replace it with hard covert action. These things worried us, the projection of these things. And yet the neighborhood where these events are taking place in India and Pakistan was reduced to cartoons and tropes. Indian police officers, Pakistan police officers were seen as sort of incompetent cartoon characters. Spies were seen as either delinquent, evil, or careless and lazy. And these kind of caricatures are really frustrating. Apart from being Islamophobic on the Pakistan side and racist when it comes to India, in the portrayal of all of these services as basically the chattels of the US. I think it's really important to get behind those. So with an event like 26/11, for us, that was hugely traumatic. By that stage, we've spent so many decades involved, and so many friends like you said who were involved.
Yes.
And two things came into play with that story. One, my experience of India is it tends to move on. There tends to be a catastrophe or some kind of act of terror is exacted on India. And because of the huge messy nature of democracy and the needs of the news hour and of people move on too quickly. And there's no memorializing of these great events that happen, or very little. It's happening a little bit more now. And so we immediately thought one thing we'd like to do is to create something a lot bigger that would sit on the shelf a lot longer and that would become different kinds of projects after this event. And that would be a testimony to the people. The people saved the city. The chefs saved the hotel. A few good cops went in armed with, a handful of rounds and faced down an orchestrated plot from Pakistan. And so our idea was to show from the grassroots up what happens inside a crisis like that without making it into a first-person shooter. We are not interested in gameplay. We're not interested in that. And I'm sure there is a propulsive energy in that book because it's a dastardly evil event that takes place inside a confined precinct of the hotel that we focused on, although many other areas of the city were affected. But the other thing we wanted to do, and this comes to where we end up, is we wanted to make the attackers real and not to turn them into ciphers either, to try and understand who is Ajmal Kassab. Is this guy born evil, or is he simply a
Right.
conduit of Pakistan intelligence, or a conduit of, in fact, much more worrying, the jihad factor in Pakistan, the groups that were enabled by ISI, but then took on a life of their own as they attacked the Pakistan state, Jaish-e-Mohammed, the group founded by the cleric Masood Azhar from Bahawalpur, or Lashkar-e-Toiba, founded by Hafiz Saeed, who operates out of Meridka outside Lahore. And then you've got the abominable sectarian groups where the
Yeah.
Sunni armed groups that hate the Shias, like Lashkar Jangvi from Jang, who then went wild in their bloodlust. And all of these groups post 2611 were turning on Pakistan in the way that they turned on India. And one
Yes.
appalling story that came out of studying for the Siege, the 2611 book, was that there was a consensus amongst these right-wing armed Sunni groups to do what they could to create regional war, because the lesson that they'd observed in the world is that statelessness, the collapse of the state, and within chaos, more terror breeds. You look at Libya, you look at what happened in Iraq after America invaded. You look at Syria with the growth then of Daesh or Islamic State. And whenever there is lawlessness and whenever the state collapses, the people who feed off it are the business of jihad that becomes the new kind of state. And so that became a concern for us. And the voices that were coming out of the 2611 conspiracy, as we began to piece it together in the years that followed, and it's a story that we never dropped. We're still picking up information on it when we were writing spy stories. What we learned is that a lot of the groups who were involved, what they're concerned to do is to create conflagration. They want to bring India and Pakistan to war, two nuclear powers,
Yes.
toe to toe over the line of control. And in that crisis, where an unknowable number of people would die, who would survive? These Islamist insurgents would come forward. And that's what they were writing about, and that's what they were speaking about, the need to create conditions of war. And this, of course, this end of days death cult became then really worrying. We began focusing on that. We were looking at that and trying to sort of link these pieces together. And, by the time we reached the stage of doing the latest book, Spy Stories, a lot more evidence had come out through the Edward Snowden archive, the leaks that came out from National Security Agency in America, but also our own contacts in American intelligence, and then with GCHQ, which is the listening technical intelligence end of British intelligence. And they all began to portray another version of 2611, which is much more the spy stories version of it, which is
Right.
how different countries had naked self-interest. And in the case of 2611, America was focusing on those jihad groups by that stage. The UK was focusing on those groups because we'd been through the disaster of the public transport bombings of 7/7.
7/7.
And the new technologies that came about, the new algorithms and coding practices after 7/7 were designed to pick up on a lot of the ways in which these Islamist terror cells operate and why governments miss them. So the first thing they picked up on was the fact that they use burner phones, disposable cheap Nokia handsets, and they only use them long enough to make a few calls. So how can you look for something that doesn't exist? That became the first quest. Look for something that doesn't exist. The second thing was to look for something that does exist, which is the use of very portable small satellite phones. So by focusing on the liminal space with burner phones and a group that would come on live with IMEI numbers and talk to each other, and focusing on satellite phones and chaining all the contacts around those groups, they began to see patterns all over the world. And two patterns that emerged in particular. One was in Iraq, which was very much to do with the growth of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Zarqawi group, and the bloodshed that was created there. And then that becomes, of course, Daesh. But the other cells that light up are in Pakistan, Kashmir. And phones there, handsets, burners, and satellites pop up. And this group of phones moves down to Karachi to an operating base. And then different assets are called in by America, the UK, and Germany in Bonn to focus down on Muzaffarabad in Pakistan, Kashmir, and in the suburbs of Karachi, and they begin to see a plot brewing, and that plot is 2611. And they get inside the control room, they understand the forces that are there, and they pick up on the intent to create regional war from the actors that are involved, the bad actors that are involved. Now, the interesting bit for us, which came so many years after we published The Siege, was that this live line of intelligence was passed over to India, along with, we've hinted at this in The Siege, 18 warnings we said at the time. But what we didn't realise was that a lot of groups were inside the operating cell and watching them. And all one can believe is either the threats weren't taken seriously enough, or there was a political intent in the belief that India had dominated Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish so successfully in Kashmir and almost crushed it that nothing would be too serious to deal with if it came over to Bombay. And for whatever reason, this plot would then grow. And so understanding that even after we've told the story from the people's point of view of 2611, all these years later, there's more technical data that comes to light. And that technical data shows you a different story, a spy war that involves CIA, NSA, the listening station, the R.A.W. that's picking up intelligence. It passes it to the IB, India's Domestic Intelligence Bureau. And yet there's another in action that takes place there. And I would like to believe it's not incompetence, because the services are very professionalized and actually have come to work extremely hard in developing intelligence. So there's a process that takes place. And just to add to the levels of this fog that happens within espionage wars, there's America's self-interest and Britain's self-interest. Britain is focusing on the Islamist armed groups that will affect the UK after 7/7. And so it's not really focusing on an ally like India. And therefore it's stovepiping its intelligence, because Lashkar-e-Toiba, that was planning this attack on India, had activated individuals in Coventry, in the West Midlands, and in Birmingham, in the UK, in the West Midlands, in the centre of the country, and was attempting to get these people to act for Lashkar-e-Toiba. They already sent a taxi driver out to the US who attempted to buy Kevlar to armour vehicles and buy different kinds of communication devices that would be useful for Lashkar. And in fact, he got caught in a joint operation with the FBI. But his links to Lashkar-e-Toiba, which is becoming more and more global as an outfit, enabled GCHQ to burrow deeper into the burgeoning 2611 plot. And the same thing that was going on with the CIA. Now, the CIA, of course, had at that time as an asset, or at least we believe this is the case, David Coleman Headley.
I know, interesting though. But I mean, I actually know someone. He stayed at the Oberoi where which is where I trained and everything.
Yeah.
And was around for a while.
Yeah.
And
Playboy.
Made friends. Got around.
Yeah, and hugely believable as a figure, and likable, I think, as a lot of psychopaths are, able to engage people, and maintain relationships. And he had his multiple wives and girlfriends spread across the world, and a different costume, a different event, one green eye, one blue, and who was he actually working for? I mean, he certainly had been working for the US intelligence agencies for quite a while. He had a link through, most importantly, developed a link through to Ilyas Kashmiri. Ilyas Kashmiri is one of the stalwarts of the Age of Jihad, someone who really became one of the big leaders and strategists of the Islamist armed groups. And he formed his own group called the 313 Brigade.
Right.
And the 313 Brigade had been very close to Lashkar-e-Toiba and to Jaish, but they gave up on both groups because they wanted to take their own radical path, and they pushed much closer to Al-Qaeda, and in fact they were a unit within Al-Qaeda. So when CIA observes that the 313 are next to Osama bin Laden's group, and when they see that a man like David Headley is moving towards and emailing Ilyas Kashmiri, he becomes of massive interest to the US, and it's not in their interest to give him up to India when they're on the path of the world's most wanted man, Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
So, there are these wheels within wheels. There's self-interest. The world of intelligence and espionage is, largely speaking, unknowable, amoral, apolitical, or not apolitical in its services, the politics of the legislature, but I mean amoral, and it does the unthinkable. And so India, in this sense, may well have been a victim of that. a victim of underestimating its enemy, one,
Mm.
and two, a victim of US self-interest.
Or overestimating its friends also. you know.
Overestimating, I like that. That's absolutely right. Overestimating its friends. All of these alliances are cold, pragmatic deals. They're not
Mm.
love marriages. And it's
Right.
really so it's important that we see that, and that even now, India got its way, and having repeatedly attacked and undermined, for good reason, the CIA ISI partnership. Now the
Yeah.
CIA is extremely close to Indian intelligence. They are close
Mm.
operating partners. The FBI are extremely close to IB, uh,
Mm.
very, very close domestic intelligence in the US. And of course, we've seen what happens to the true nature of pragmatism is what happens to US allies. The Kurds helped defeat Islamic State. Trump abandoned them to Turkey on the Turkish border. Um, the
Yes.
Afghan National Army and the Tajiks helped preserve the pro-Indian state of affairs in Kabul. They were abandoned by Biden. And so, these are pragmatic relationships. America's
Mm.
redefining itself, and India is at this time a convenient buffer in the showdown with
Mm.
China. And so, again, there are these larger pieces that
Right.
come into play, which are fascinating. But that's geopolitics. We're very interested in the people in the midst of all this,
Mm.
and the
Mm.
untold stories. The untold stories, the untold voices. We did a book called The Exile, and the point of The Exile was to fill in the missing narrative with Al Qaeda. If you're the world's most wanted man and you're on the run, and you've got an increasing number of relationships to look after, and those relationships have children, and then more children need more
Mm.
nappies, need more plastic toys, and yet you're trying to conceal your pathway, your jet stream,
Yeah.
and yet the more clutter of childhood and family life drags you into the public. We were concerned with the kitchen sink drama, with The
Mm.
Exile, as well as the political arc of a group hiding in Iran, which we were
Must read
among.
that. I haven't read that one as yet. I
Yeah,
know when I was working in Dubai, there was one of the Bin Laden brothers came and stayed at the hotel I was working at, and
yeah,
one of the prominent Bin Laden brothers, and it gave me pause. That look at his lifestyle,
right.
and
Yeah,
and
totally. Yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah.
crazy the choices that people make,
The
and
choices, that's right. There's a great photo of the Bin Laden brothers together, and Osama's dressed in black, looming, scowling in the photo, like kind of the black sheep in the photo, the dysfunctional child. It's really interesting what becomes of people. But also, we need to know them. We need to know them. We need to know Lashkar-e-Toiba. We need to know Jaish-e-Mohammed. We need to know who these people are, and the caricatures are not helpful. We need to understand their family dynamics and their motivations, and we need to tell those stories so that when you have an event like Pulwama that takes place in India, you understand why it happens.
right, right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think very often we forget that they're human beings,
Mm,
and they become numbers, and we don't really want to go that deep into what motivates them or any of that. They're terrorists, full stop.
yeah,
And cycle continues, unfortunately.
that's right. And
And
I think that breeds war. I mean, it breeds war
mm,
because there's no attempt at political solution. One thing you see, we mentioned in the book that a great thing that influenced us, a great film was called Gatekeepers. It's made by
mhm,
an Israeli journalist and filmmaker called Dror, and he managed through persistence to get the heads of internal intelligence Shin Bet to come, and he had one, and then he got two, and then he got three, and then before you knew it, he had a raft of these invisible faces who came onto TV to describe the inner workings of Israel-Palestine's secret war, the covert war. And an interesting passageway for all of those hot action intelligence officers was that they all came to believe that their jobs ultimately were futile unless there was a political solution. And that
mm,
while they may provide, intelligence and they may provide insight and analysis, the lion's share of their job, which was involved in covert action, simply increased the carnage. Unless you get to know the individuals who are involved and invest in them and move towards a political solution, then all you'll do is breed more violence. And so watching those intelligence officers go on that trajectory was why we then sought out spies in Pakistan and India, looking to see if they
mm.
were making similar connections.
You know, one of the fun things I do, if you can call it fun, is to go on YouTube and watch the Pakistani channels,
Yeah.
and the interviews they do. And they had a former ISI chief who was who's no more, Hamid Gul, I think,
Mm,
is very chatty,
mm.
and he pretty much laid out the entire ISI Afghan plan. It's gone as per his, his, I guess at that time he may have been a bit of a fantasist. He was out of par. He was on the sidelines and was more of a television talking head. But everything he said has happened. So one wonders, what about American intelligence? I mean, were they not watching Hamid Gul's YouTube videos, or
Well,
he,
I've said this. I've said this in a number of different ways, but I think it's important to repeat that the ISI didn't win in Afghanistan. Um, a certain collision of appallingly managed events
hmm,
felled the administration in Kabul and undermined America's plan. And those events were nearly all the mismanagement of the US and its allies that were involved: the British, the Germans, the Italians, and other people who got involved with ISAF and the Afghan National Army. I mean, America started off needing to take action after the calamity and tragedy of 9/11, and yet
hmm,
everyone warned it. Many people at least warned it not to take action against the Taliban ostensibly, but to divide the Taliban and Al Qaeda and take
hmm,
action against Al
hmm,
Qaeda. That advice was presented to it by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, by some in the Tony Blair government. It was presented by the ISI. They gave a huge amount of evidence as to why a grassroots movement would be almost impossible for foreigners to winkle out of Afghanistan. That advice was ignored, and instead a broad scope campaign with very few troops on the ground, largely through aerial war, began killing a load of civilians as well as trying to wipe out Al Qaeda and taking the battle to the Taliban, who didn't plan 9/11. And then at a point when the Taliban are weak, America spuriously invades Iraq with falsified intelligence and then creates a Shia Sunni civil war. And in fact, the Shia Sunni antagonism, which as a virus then spreads around the world in a way that had never been seen before. And that was also a experimental war with no troops involved, but largely aerial, or very little few troops involved, and largely aerial, and mismanaged also by Rumsfeld Cheney in the way that the first war was mismanaged. And that carnage would then spread through the creation of the caliphate, much larger than the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, through Islamic State, which would then, incorporate the bloodshed in Syria. Libya would collapse, and in the midst of all of this carnage, then these individuals who were activated through the internet, people who were living in inner cities all over the Europe where exclusion and criminality come together, people who may not have actually a faith in Islamic State became activated by it. And we saw the carnage in France, Belgium, the UK, Germany, other places, single stabbers, drive-by bombings, etc. This is the responsibility of the misfiring wars
hmm,
of the
hmm,
Bush-Cheney era, and they created a mirage in Kabul, which they like to pretend was the whole of Afghanistan, which it wasn't. India got sucked into that in believing that what it was investing in along the Durran line with its consuls and its different projects like the dam project, etc., and Kabul investments.
libraries, yeah.
Yeah, but in fact, these were not real things. And what you see is not the victory of the Taliban. What you see over the recent 6-8 weeks is a pragmatic calculus made by people living in the provinces, and that calculation is this: who to believe in. Do we bank on the corrupt
Yes.
warlords in
Hmm.
Kabul? The corruption was endemic, or do we look at a movement which already by 2013 had shadow governors in 2/3 of the provinces of Afghanistan? And do we just make a decision that that's more tangible power? And so there was no military victory, there was a capitulation. There's a capitulation
Right.
whereby people will believe in what's real and not what's fanciful, and the next thing you know, painlessly, the Taliban are installed. And this is the succession. So to portray it, Pakistan predicted it, but Pakistan did not enable that. Pakistan enabled elements of the Taliban to survive. Sure, it gave them sanctuary. It tortured some. It made a few disappear. It tried to micromanage. But an interesting thing is that the internal reporting of ISI shows that it panicked for 2/3 of that time, wondering how to make Taliban cohesive, wondering how to get heard, wondering how to gain greater political control because the movement was sprawling across the country. And there are many spoilers involved. There's Russia involved, there's Saudi Arabia involved, there's Iran
China.
involved, there's Turkey involved, Qatar's involved, China's involved. And, one thing we should say is this is the most interesting facet is what will Pakistan make of those groups now? Because now that the dysfunctional ANA has fallen aside, and now ISAF doesn't exist, which was also dysfunctional, the Italians bribed the Taliban not to fight them. The British made side deals and withdrew from Helmand because it couldn't win. The Americans only fought an aerial war, which killed more civilians than anyone else. What will Pakistan do to knit together the new coalition of people who hate each other? Iran and Saudi Arabia, they won't work together. Turkey and Saudi Arabia, they won't work together. China, suspicious of all of them. Qatar, under sanctions and embargoed by Saudi Arabia until January of this year, and yet facilitating the opening of the airport. So, before people leap to more chauvinist ideas that you get on a lot of chat shows, the ISI's greatest victory since, equivalent to 1971. It's
Yes,
Bangladesh all over again.
they're
Yeah.
gloating.
They're then, what they're looking at is they're looking at a nightmare. They also know two things. They know that if you do not enable a state to form quickly, terror will take hold. That terror will be the TTP, Pakistan Taliban, Jaish-e-Mohammed and other groups that are also anti-Indian. And up until 2017, these groups almost brought Pakistan to its knees. They almost collapsed the state.
But the ISI chief ended up in Kabul, which we watched with great curiosity in India. He ended up in Kabul right when their cabinet was being formed. And, that was interesting. Like, why?
Well,
definitely points
he's
to...
he's a facilitator.
That's work, of course.
Yeah,
so,
you're right. No, you're absolutely right. They will attempt to knit together a coalition that's workable. But there's something else going on with General Fez, and that is, of course, that he's in a jockeying position to become chief of the army staff, the army chief. Be decided in a year's time, and so to be seen suave, man of action in his civvies and moccasins in a five-star hotel lobby in the peak of a global event where Biden's fleeing in the opposite direction is a win-win propaganda-wise. So you've got to read through the story and see that there's a guy who's talking to his home constituency and saying, I could be the next army chief. And from there, he went and made secret trips to Tajikistan and tried to work out some new deals with Massoud and the Tajiks in the Panjshir Valley. And he went and did a lot of other fun things invisibly, like spies do. So, it's there's the public messaging and there's the private messaging. And we're all watching now to see what will happen. There's a lot of rash predictions being made, but let's wait and see, what happens in that space.
And just your book, I realized that we've been talking about everything.
The world, yeah.
I haven't got to the book. I guess people will have to read that one.
Yeah,
but how different did you find the ISI and the RAW when it comes to temperament?
Well, I think, the first thing to say, regardless of what we think of the actions of spy agencies, which can be repugnant, immoral, baffling, mystifying, they're both the subject of tropes and cliches that are not true. They're both extremely disciplined, which again undermines one of the big tropes. People write, and I think we said this in the book, that RAW is, a befuddled agency, slow to act, that is overly bureaucratic, inept, underfunded. They're the cliches. And the ISI is full of rogue operators, or itself is rogue, cannot be controlled. And these things are wrong. They're demonstrably wrong. ISI is a unified, disciplined body, which also means that it has to take the rap for when things go bad. It does stuff because it orders it, and the chain of command is maintained. And I also doubt, really, the story that ISI is radicalized. I think it went through a period where faith became more important after Zia and the 80s and the secret war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. But it also brought in extra training and lessons to make the force emulsified together around Islamic ideas that suited the state. And in fact, what it was a victim of was the puppet groups that it created to attack India, then attacked it. And in
Yeah.
fact, that connected with a huge number of special forces and spies who went AWOL and started also to join those religious armed groups and attack the Pakistan state, would lead to the deaths of 43, 45, 48,000 people by 2014. And we've seen the figures that Pakistan puts in it are something like $128 billion loss on their exchequer. Country nearly brought to its knees. India, the victim of a lot of terror as well from those
Mm,
backfiring groups. RAW, it turns out, actually operates because it maintains a lot of secrecy, operates globally like a full spectrum intelligence agency, and a lot more successfully than Indians give it credit for. It has a huge ability to play the narratives game and tell stories. It tells
mm,
stories with IB to the Indian electorate for good and for bad, good stories and bad stories. And also,
mm,
it tells stories to the world, to people of influence and world leaders. And it's very successful at projecting Pakistan as a terror state, and also projecting Islamism as a threat. And it does it very successfully. It's also worked extremely hard in different difficult soft areas. For example, to make alliances with Islamic states that normally were not friends of India. It's done extremely well in the Emirates and with Saudi
mm.
Arabia, and now
Saudi
it's
Arabia.
trying hard with Iran and Turkey. Let's see where that goes. And it always kept one eye on China, and that has been less successful. But extraordinary measures were begun in the mid '80s, which were a great effort by R.A.W. They've also had loads of wins, loads of very
Mm,
successful wins. Cargill is a great win, and it's a great story. Cargill, I mean, it involves
mm,
the use of technical intelligence and eavesdropping as well as military force. And really, along the way, many things have happened where you get to see an outfit like RAW succeeding. Organized crime and the way that it operates inside the Gulf and Thailand is another
oh,
fascinating
yes.
area. Uh, you
Oh,
know,
yes. Oh,
and the way it's countered the growth of different well-known crime groups that you are written about a lot in India,
there are
which we won't.
in Clifton Road, Karachi, from what we know. We
Yeah,
don't need an
yeah,
intelligence agency to tell us that.
yeah. Very active in the Sindh and very active within MQM, but also within Kashmir. I mean, Raw IB created its own puppets and surrogates, and it created forces of renegades. They worked with the special operations group or special task force of the police, and they operated in covert ways. And those groups were trained by counterinsurgency specialists from around the world, in the way that Pakistan spy agency took training from CIA. So you begin to see patterns there growing, and a lot more hot action than Indians believe happens because raw orders it.
Hmm. And do you, in a utopian world, do you ever see like the way Indians cooperate with the CIA and the FBI? Do you ever see the ISI and the RAW cooperating? Although our ex chiefs did come together and pen a book
Yeah,
where, they couldn't even launch the book, I think, together.
yeah, no, he got put on the
Stop
exit.
bad
He got put on
timing.
the exit control list. That's right. Yeah. Um, the back channel under Musharraf, I don't think people realise how close it was to succeeding. Between 2004 and 2000 and late 2007, talks moved extremely rapidly to a level where massive solutions were possible. Kashmir, shared waters, um, the Ran
Hmm.
of Kutch. I mean, loads of different related and aggravating issues were on the table, and they came extraordinarily close. Musharraf's inability to hold on to power, the entropy within Pakistan as the state began to
Hmm.
collapse, and the work of these Islamist groups that were against peace and were against Musharraf
Hmm.
meant they were also against the back channel. They didn't want there to be peace between Pakistan and India. And as news of the back channel began to leak out, that's when the formation of a plot like 2611 happens, because the Always War Brigade will do
Hmm.
everything they can to always make
Hmm.
war. And actually, the war, the near war situation of 2611 came at a time when Pakistan was extraordinarily near to resolving a lot of issues with India.
Right.
So at that time, ISI RAW were probably elements of ISI and RAW were probably more contiguous than they've ever been, more parallel than they've ever been. And yet after 26/11, having come so close, things have become the worst they've ever been. They'd reached their
Right.
nadir where both sides would totally distrust each other, and all sorts of reciprocal hot actions would come about, and they'd become manifest in the Kulbushan Yadav spy affair, where one
Yes.
nation takes an
Yeah.
individual, exploits him in order to hurt another. And and now it would be very hard to see how those talks would come about.
Indeed, thank you so very much, Adrian. I've stolen a little more time than you granted us, but it was riveting listening to you, as it is reading your books.
Thank you.
And that's a lovely combination there. That you're just as interesting when you speak. So
Thank you.
and I think one thing, I mean, that comes true. I mean, in the last, I hate to say this, but in the last couple of years, we've not seen a major terror attack in India.
Yeah,
Of
for
the
sure.
scale.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I don't want to jinx it and say it because, the world has changed in such ways.
Yeah.
But I think one thing that rings really true is that we don't realize it as we go on with our lives, but really how close we are to being a statistic in many
Totally
ways.
right. Totally. And Pulwama did happen, and Pathankot did happen, which
Yeah.
were aimed at the military and military events.
I mean, civilian, yes, I must.
Yeah, but on the civilian things, you're right. And when we all live under that shadow, and it's very important to say to people who are watching this as well that a lot of hate mongering takes place right now. A lot of communalism, that would wish people to fear things that aren't yet happening. Fear the advent of Al Qaeda moving into Kashmir. Fear the advent of the rise of white flags of the Taliban in Kabul affecting Srinagar. These are nightmare wishes. At the moment, there's no evidence that these things are happening. People are raising this as the spectre, and at this time, when communities need to come together, at this time when there needs to be more organized politics to bring people together, we shouldn't just focus on what may happen in these nightmare scenarios, but focus on what is happening. It's really important to demystify at these tinderbox times and to understand that that people can win through these things. We shouldn't live in fear. People can win. People can organize. I mean, COVID is a very good example of the human
Right.
spirit overcoming. What people did all around the world, and especially in India, is they overcame the incompetence of their governments. And they fought to save themselves. It happened in Britain. People cooked for each other. People found resources for each other. It happened all over the world, as far as I'm aware, and people have saved themselves again, just like they saved themselves in 26/11.
That is so true. And on that hopeful note, thank you so much for joining us on what is the first episode of Page Turners. So I'm really happy to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Lovely. And you had mentioned in one of your other interviews that there were some geostrategic writers in India that you read very carefully who were brilliant, who never got their due. Would you just like to mention one or two of them so that those of our viewers who want to read up on this?
There are many people. I've got a bibliography at the back of the book of people I love who've written. But I mean, there's I really admire. There's a lot of writers and thinkers in India and in Pakistan who have never stopped working, and I think I've listed them in the preface. I thanked them, and I put their books in the book list at the back. So please do consult that list.
All right, thank you so much, Adrian. It's
Take
such
care.
a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to your next book.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you.